Nice bright winter morning in Bombay. I welcome all of you to the 9th of the Emerging Markets Finance Conference. I think that I said last year that I was surprised at how well we are growing, so I will not say it again, but it looks like a spectacular program. And other than thanking all of you from the bottom of our hearts for having taken time off from a busy schedule to come here and be with us and participate in some of these fascinating discussions, I would like to just take 1 minute off to thank all our sponsors who make this possible. There's a checklist of them this year, and it's been really nice of them to come in and pitch to help make this possible. But you know, the wonderful thing about the Emerging Markets Finance Conference is that we started as a 2-day finance-focused conference, and today it's just taken a new form and a new structure with an amalgamation of people who are legal scholars and who are people who come in from other parts of the ecosystem that makes finance such a wonderful field to do research work in. And part of that is a collaboration with Vanderbilt Law University, Law School, and the person who started off this entire madness of the collaboration was Yesha Yadav. She's standing in the corner. And Yesha and Randall Thomas, who is the head of the law and the business program at Vanderbilt, have put in a lot to make this work, and I'd like to invite Randall to come in and do his bit to welcome our audience to this conference, and we'll take it forward from there.
Well, thank you all very much for being here, and thank our host, Susan, for making this all so possible. It's a great privilege and honor for Vanderbilt to have the opportunity to come to India and to address so many intellectuals and finance and legal and other economists. The Law and Business Program is a program that we started back in 2001. It's designed to train lawyers in not only legal skills, but also financial and accounting skills so that they can be better transactional lawyers. It's part of a system of programs that our law school has put together to try to bring legal education into the 21st century. So thank you all for being here, and thank you again, Susan, for sponsoring this event and bringing us all together. I look forward to the conference.
Thank you, Ryan. So, as I said, the nice thing about being in finance is that we sit on the cusp of so many different parts of the ecosystem that make it possible. Law is one of it. The financial markets are one of it. And I think that compared with the last year's conference, I think this year's conference gives me great pleasure because there is so much more of a focus on securities markets, where I have a personal bias because that's where my entire research work is steeped in. And it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this year, who is Larry Harris. Larry Harris is at the Marshall School of Business in the University of Southern California. Full disclaimer, I knew him as a kid of, I think, 21, if you can even think about, or maybe 23, when I took a course of his, which was on market microstructure. I'd just fallen in love with the concept of financial markets. I thought that was the best thing that the human race had ever invented. And here was this professor teaching us about market microstructure, and he did even more fantastic things like getting Jack Trainer, who was, in my eyes, God. So I was fangirling throughout the entire Jack Trainer session. I didn't really listen to much of what he said. I wish I had. But I just wanted to say that you may look through Larry's bio, which is in the program handout. But the funny thing about Larry that gives me has put me where I am today in a certain sense is that when I finished my thesis and got back in, I forget, 1995, a long time ago, we as a country were just thinking about changes in market microstructure. We had started thinking about electronic trading platforms, anonymous trading, dematerialization of all securities. And the other thing that was being talked about at that time was a separation between forward contracting and spot contracting, and transactions on spot and forwards, which was actually mixed up in the first way that we used to do trading on equities exchanges in India. And I think that Larry's class gave me confidence to stand up and say, I understand the difference between forwards and futures. And I don't think anyone had got it because it's about institutions, and institutions are so deep and fundamental to the way that we do finance. And I think over the last 25, 30 years, we've seen a tremendous shift in institutions and the way we do trading and the way we do financial transactions all across the world. It's not just India. But we had an advantage because we were thinking about it from scratch. We were a very young country. And Larry's class gave me this big advantage. I know what futures are. They are standardized, they have counterparty credit risk management, and that's what makes a difference from forwards contracts. I don't think anyone quite got the difference, but they gave me benefit of doubt. And for that, I'm eternally thankful to Larry. And I'm very, very happy that he's taken time off to be here today and speak to us about the topic on hand, which is actually when you do create an anonymous trading platform, what are the challenges and how do we give faith to each other when we are effectively transacting with strangers? In the old world of finance, it used to be, financial transactions used to be a club of gentlemen who used to make promises and those promises were upheld. And if those promises weren't upheld, you had strange ways of dealing with it. Today, it has to be much more transparent. And I invite Larry Harris to come and give us his talk on this topic. Thank you. Larry Harris.
Thank you, Susan. Will this mic be sufficient? Can I push that out of the way? Does this work? Yeah. Everybody's happy. Very good. Okay. Well, before I start, let me, as I look out this room, I have so many Indian students in. You're good? You would prefer? This better? Okay. We're good then, huh? Yeah. Very good. Okay, very good. I have so many Indian students at USC. As I look out at this room, I say, you know, it doesn't really feel like I'm in India. Of course, the jet lag reminds me. So, I hope that my title here, Achieving High N Squared, doesn't put anybody off. There's essentially almost no mathematics in this presentation. We'll be teasing you with this notion of n squared through here. I'll be teasing you in a few other ways. I'm trying to take an extremely serious topic and organize it in a way that you will be able to hopefully assimilate it and remember it and perhaps most importantly be able to sit through it. So a few introductory comments. This is a very general discussion that I'm going to have here. Pretty unusual for me, I think. We're really talking about the fundamental elements of civilization. Civilization's about relating well with other people, including strangers. And the relations among strangers are often most difficult because you don't know them and often don't trust them. It turns out that economic growth requires that strangers interact with each other. And when they can't, you don't get very much economic growth. So that's why this is such an extraordinarily important topic. Well-developed economies have efficient systems to ensure that strangers can interact with each other. Allow them to write contracts and enforce those contracts with strangers. So emerging markets that can improve these systems, they will grow faster, and that's the importance here. Okay, so that's the overall view of what we're talking about here. And let's move forward. Here's a quick confession. I suspect in a room of, there's a lot of accomplishment in this room. I suspect that you may know all or perhaps most all of the principles that I'm going to present here today, which makes me nervous because I really don't want to waste your time. But perhaps not the application to a wedding receptions that we're going to enjoy shortly. I have a digression. We'll be talking about wedding receptions. Okay? It's my hope, though, that the organization and the generalization in my presentation will be useful to you and useful for a variety of ways to help structure your mind about how incredibly important these issues are and perhaps also to help you promote these issues with other people. And if I accomplish those goals, I'll be very, very happy. Parenthetically, I'll note that in discussing the topics that I'm going to discuss that may already be quite familiar to you, my approach will be very different from what you've normally seen. My approach is the approach of a market microstructure economist, and so I'm going to work sort of from the bottom to the top instead of perhaps from top to bottom, as you may have seen these topics presented before. So as I discuss the benefits and challenges of trading with strangers, I'd like you to consider how these issues affect growth in emerging markets. So that's my charge to you, and my responsibility to you is to make sure that as I proceed, I keep your attention with a little bit of humor and hopefully some good organization. And some graphics that, frankly, I'm quite proud of. So I may not be the world's most modest person. I apologize for that. Okay, so the importance of these topics cannot be overstated or expressed too often. So our agenda today, we're going to review what trading is. We'll talk about why trading is beneficial. All of this certainly is a review to most of you. We'll then start talking about the search for liquidity, and we'll focus most of our time on counterparty risk, because that's the characteristic problem associated with trading with strangers. And I'll talk about how settlement problems are solved, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about some public policy implications. So, all set. A lot of signaling among the AV people. So, a quick overview of trading. Okay, so trades in general occur when two people exchange something for something else. That's a very general notion. Okay, and the trade can be for cash or barter. And my discussion today is not only about finance, it's about all trade. Okay, now we can classify trades according to what's being traded. Sometimes it's unique, a unique object, and sometimes it's fungible. And that's going to be very important for understanding how people organize trading. The trade may settle immediately, or it may involve commitments that are in the future. So we'd say that the trade may have an element of futurity. The trades that settle immediately aren't that difficult. Basically, you got somebody here, and they go zip, and the trade is done. A quick exchange, you don't have much counterparty risk. But when there are commitments to make future payments or deliveries of goods or services in the future, then you have a misbalance between a commitment and perhaps the flow of cash or a reliance of some sort and the actual performance. At which point it becomes very important that you trust the person on the other side to perform as they say they will, and that they have the credit to do so. So there's a distinction between trustworthiness and creditworthiness. Trustworthiness is that somebody says that they will try to do what they said they're going to do. And creditworthiness is that they're actually able to do it. And of course, you need both of them to settle a trade. So future settlements can be quite problematic, and we'll spend most of our time talking about the future. So a few examples of traded goods, of course, financial instruments, goods and properties, services. I'm talking about essentially everything today. Okay? A voluntary trade is an agreement, and thus a contract between the two parties. So I use the word today, trade and contract, synonymously. Perhaps it's a reflection of my lack of discipline. The attorneys among you probably are getting a little edgy right now. That's okay, don't worry about it. So legal concepts involve notions of reliance and consideration that I won't really be discussing today. And of course, I'd like to remind you that you shouldn't rely on me for economic advice. I've long enjoyed studying law casually, and in some cases a little bit more formally. It's a great pleasure for me, and a challenge, and a bit of a fear, frankly, to talk so much law today about in front of so many people who are so accomplished. But that said, don't rely on me for legal advice. Okay, so here are a bunch of examples of things that are traded. I'm not going to go through the entire table. I believe that you will have these slides available to you afterwards, and so you can look through them. But in terms of the things that I've identified here, I have on in the columns the different settlement timing, things that are traded on spot markets versus things that have future commitment, and then on the left-hand side, what's fungible versus what's unique. So fungible things that trade on spot market are like currencies. You may have engaged in one of those transactions when you came through the airport yesterday or the day before. Things that involve future commitments, most things, frankly. And even many spot trades still have an element of futurity because they often settle 3 days later or 2 days later, during which time things can happen that can be unpleasant. So we'll talk more about those things. So those are financial instruments. Goods and services, you can imagine essentially everything. and traded goods, traded services. Here's examples. So among fungible things, spot market, essentially day labor. That's pretty much spot market. Unique things, professional services with future commitments. So those of you who are engaged in expert witnessing, you're in the lower right-hand corner of this box. Okay, so let's do a quick review of why trade is beneficial. And of course, this is a review for virtually everybody, I should think, but still it's worthwhile considering it because it is so incredibly important to the welfare of our society. So we presume that when a trade occurs, it's because the buyer values the item more than the seller does. And as a consequence, they're both better off. So what we'd like to happen is that the buyers who value the item most, they ought to be trading with the sellers who value it least. Okay, so we were talking about why trade is so beneficial. And I was arguing, first of all, when trade is voluntary, we get a benefit from it. But more than that, if we can find a way where the people who value items most are the buyers and the people who value them least are the sellers, then we end up maximizing the gains for trade. And the good news about that is that happens automatically because traders enforce that rule. They're always looking for the buyers are always looking for the lowest prices and the sellers are always looking for the highest prices. So that self-enforcement in a free market where the trades are voluntarily arranged produces a lot of value. Okay? So trade also lowers production costs. The lowest priced seller of produced goods and of services is usually the one who can produce at the lowest cost. And so lowest cost, I'll remind everybody, means not dollar cost, but really means the lowest cost to resources. Economy is full of resources, and if resources are used efficiently in an economy, then the economy will be very productive and it'll ultimately be rich. So our object is to get resources to be used efficiently. We often value resources with dollars or rupees or other currencies, but ultimately it's really the resources that we're concerned about and not their dollar value. So sales by the lowest cost producers minimize the total use of resources, and that's the benefit to society. And that's why we like free trade. So many products or services have multiple components. So when production requires the assembly of multiple components or the application perhaps of multiple processes, and I'll note parenthetically, as I did here, that essentially everything does, then trade allows producers to specialize in those parts that they're best at. And that specialization ensures that we use the least amount of resource to produce the most. And that's what produces wealthy economies. So specialization lowers production costs so that end consumers are ultimately best off because the economy uses the least amount of resources to accomplish the most. And that's what we're looking for. So what are the determinants of prosperity? Well, clearly free trade, and that's largely what we'll be talking about today. But just for completeness, let's note what the other major determinants of prosperity are. We won't be talking about these. Most importantly, the physical security of persons and property. That's essential for free trade, and it's essential for a comfortable life. Of course, productive know-how, which is why we encourage so much educational efforts. Of course, this is one element of disseminating know-how, conferences like this. And of course, natural resources, which I place at the end of the list. If you can master the first three items on this list, you don't really need the natural resources because you can trade for them. If there's any doubt in your mind on this issue, consider the wealth of Singapore. So what are the three main impediments to trade? The first one is finding suitable counterparties. There's a search problem to find the person who can provide you the best price or the best service or the best product. You have to go out and look, and that requires a lot of effort. And then if you're trading with somebody and there's an element of futurity, you have to be concerned about counterparty risk. So these are two problems that involve trading with strangers, and hence the title of my talk. There's another impediment that's not in today's talk, but again, for completeness, I'd like to bring it to your attention. The government can always get in the way. They can get in the way through tariffs, through taxes, unnecessary regulations, through quotas. When I say unnecessary regulations, I recognize the importance of regulations. Unnecessary regulations is when you go beyond what's needed to ensure that the market operates efficiently. So while I'm not a promoter of regulation, I recognize that it's necessary and important, but it should be constrained only by its need. Regulations are necessary sometimes because it's the least cost, not always, but often it's the least cost way of enforcing good behavior or assigning property rights or preventing people from taking things that aren't theirs, which is essentially good behavior. Okay, so let's now talk about trading with strangers. Things start getting fun now. Okay, so a quick overview. If the issue is trying to search for other people, then consolidation helps. Bringing people together in one way or another lowers their search costs. But ultimately, those strangers, if they are strangers to each other, must be willing to trade with each other. So we're going to talk about these two issues. The first one is fairly simple, and so I won't spend too much time on it. The second one is far more interesting. We'll spend the bulk of our talk talking about counterparty risk. Okay, so let's talk about network value, and now I introduce the n squared. Why does n squared matter? So n is going to refer to the number of people who could potentially trade with each other. And it turns out that the number of potential trades grows with the square of the number of traders. Now, if math wasn't your forte, don't worry about it. You'll see it in just a moment, quite clearly. So let's go forward. So here we have only one trader. You can't trade with anybody, right? That guy's kind of lonely. Okay, so now we got another person in our economy, and now we have one potential trade. So there's a connection between them. Now, I don't know that they're going to trade. Let's talk for a moment about whether they will. So the potential trade may not occur. Okay, so one or both traders may not be interested in trading. Okay, maybe whatever they have is already allocated efficiently, and they're happy. They may not know about each other. If they don't know about each other, they can't do the trade. And they may not trust the other person, so the counterparty may not settle the trade. So even though there's a potential trade, there's no guarantee that they will trade. Okay, well, let's add another person. So we just added another person, and with one more person, there were two more potential trades. So that's looking a little bit more promising. And let's add another person. Now we have 6 potential trades with 4 people. You guys probably can see where this is going, right? So let's add some more. Here's 8 traders, and we have now 28 potential trades. And they're growing, and they're growing rather quickly. And the way they're growing is actually according to the square of the number of traders. Now, this picture may be familiar to you because some of you had experience with this picture in nursery school. Did anybody have these boards where the little pegs were put in there and you put rubber bands around them or little strings and stuff like that? Well, you were learning network economics. You just didn't know it. Okay, so that's exactly what we're dealing with here. Okay, so potential trades grow quite quickly. With n traders, the number of potential trades is given by this expression. It's n times n minus 1 over 2. If you've seen this expression before, you usually see it's n times n plus 1 over 2. That's the sum of the numbers from 1 on to n. Here we're summing the numbers from 0 on to n minus 1. And that's why the expression looks just slightly different. Okay, so for large n, this number is proportional to n squared. And that's the end of all the mathematics that we're going to see today. Okay, but it's a very important issue. Okay, so what are the benefits of trading? For a potential beneficiary of trading, the probability of trading increases with the number of potential counterparties, as long as you can find them, of course. And for the whole economy, the benefits of trading grow with this number because more people could benefit from trading, that's obvious, but also because the potential beneficiaries can more likely trade, which is less obvious, but still very, very important. Okay. So here's the incredible potential of India. There you go. We missed one guy. That guy, the little guy in blue, somehow got left out. So pay attention to him because he'll be important in the rest of our presentation. He'll come up shortly when we talk about, oh, let me not spoil it. Okay, so the search for liquidity. Liquidity is the ability to trade whatever it is that you want to trade, when you want to do the trade, and not at much transaction cost. By transaction costs, I mean the costs of arranging the trade. I'm not talking about the purchase price. Okay, so that's liquidity. We normally think of liquidity when we talk about financial markets, but the concept applies to the trading of goods and services as well. So I'll remind you that we're talking about financial trades, we're talking about everything. Very important concept. So what's the n squared lesson? Economies benefit when traders can easily find each other and trade. Okay? And to this end, we have a number of systems that help match people together so that they can arrange trades. So in the financial markets, we have brokers and exchanges. And then we have, in goods and services, you may have marketplaces. You can have fairs, bulletin boards, advertising, conferences. All these things are designed to allow people to get to know each other at a single point where their objective is common. That is to find a way of arranging trades, figuring out who wants what, who's got what, and put them together in one way or another. Okay, so finding each other is easiest when everybody interested in trading gathers at the same place and at the same time. If they're not in the same place and at the same time, then what you need are intermediaries who can match people together. So for instance, a broker may identify a buyer and seller who are in different places and say, you ought to meet each other. Or a dealer will do a business, so you've got a buyer who arrives in the morning and a seller who arrives in the afternoon. And they're not connected, but the dealer will say, I'll make that connection from you. I will sell to the buyer, and then I'll cover the position by buying back from the seller later in the afternoon. In effect, connecting the buyer to the seller through their intermediation. So a lot of people are in the intermediation business. As long as we're talking about that, let's talk about the arbitrageur. The arbitrageur sees a buyer and a seller in two different places that they don't know about each other. The arbitrageur stands in between and sells to the buyer and buys from the seller, and that arranges the trade as well. Okay? So there are solutions when people don't all gather at the same place and time, but it's certainly easier when they do. Okay. So now the question is how do we increase n squared? And let's talk first for the financial markets. Markets are most liquid when everybody's willing to trade the same instrument. So if you get everybody willing to trade the same instrument, then you don't have this problem of he wants to trade this and he wants to trade that. And especially if the two things are similar, well, it still doesn't work. Okay, so if you have an instrument in between that is less than perfect for both parties, that instrument can still be extraordinarily useful if it's very liquid. Because it's very liquid, allow one guy to trade with the other. They won't be trading exactly what they want, but they'll be getting close enough that you can get a lot of use out of that. Okay? So great liquidity can make a less than perfect instrument attractive to many traders. So instruments designed to appeal to many different interests are most successful. And those would be the standardized futures contracts and instruments like exchange-traded funds and other exchange-traded products. So, here we go. We got the digression. Okay, so for those of you who didn't want to learn about wedding receptions, let me apologize ahead of time, but I think that you'll find this interesting. So the question is, are round tables or long tables best? There actually is a reason for this digression. There's a lesson in it for our study. Okay, so are long tables or round tables best? Let's have a quick poll here. How many people think it's the round tables? Okay, and that's pardon?
Best for what?
Good question. Excellent. That's Venki. He's probably really well trained. Venki was my student at USC. Okay, so excellent question. So let's provide an objective. We want the guests to enjoy the reception. Okay, so that's not always the right objective. I think it should be, personally, but that's just me. But other people involved may have other objectives. Perhaps the bride and groom or the mother or father of the participants may have different issues. And certainly the caterer has a different issue as well. Okay, but I saw that the majority of you thought that it was round tables. Let's take another very quick poll. How many people have gone almost exclusively to weddings with round tables as opposed to square tables? So that's certainly me, right? Almost all the, and maybe things are different here in India. In which case, you know, at the cradle of civilization, you've discovered the right answer before other people. In the United States, it's almost all long tables. How many people think it's long tables that they see most often at wedding receptions? Just a couple hands. Okay, so, so let's go and see which is best. Okay, so a good conversation is a trade between the conversationalists that makes them all happy, right? So that's what we're looking for. That's my objective, at least. Here's a round table with 12 guests. You ready for this? Look at that incredible potential. Those are all the lines connecting every possible trade here. There are 66 potential conversations there. Anybody know the problem here? Here's the problem. That's the centerpiece. You got 12 potential conversations once you factor in the centerpiece. All those linkages don't always work, right? And you got 12 poor ones. The poor ones are let's see, a good potential is these two guys. A poor one is this one to this one. But it's worse than this. You remember that little blue guy we talked about? There he is. He's not having a very good time. So the blue guy at the top of the table there, his partners here on either side are talking to each other. How many people have been in that experience? I certainly have. It's bad news. So it doesn't work quite so well as we think. Okay, now here's a long table with 12 guests. Okay, and now I exaggerated things here, right? 12 guests around a round table. It's actually common, but probably it's a little more common to have 10 guests. 8 guests on a round table with a smaller table is a little less common, at least in the United States. But even with 8, the same problem. Okay, so I, of course, exaggerated, and I'll be the first to be caught doing it. So let's have our long table with 12 guests. And here we go. Here's the blue guy at the long table. Now, the blue guy has what I would consider to be 5 really good conversational potentials. And in fact, and I noticed this last night at dinner, that it was actually, you can do pretty well going from there over to here as well. Okay? And there's a lot of multilateral conversation too. So that's pretty neat. So that's my argument for why it should be long tables and not round tables. So here we have 29 good potential conversations with a couple of people having a little more potential than the others. So you may want to note that the best place to sit at the table, I think, is probably one person off from the corner, if there is somebody sitting at the corner, because you'll have 6 potential conversations rather than 5. And now, depends on the reach between here and here, but it's still pretty good. So, in any event, so a little unexpected wisdom that you didn't think you were going to get today, huh? Here we go. Okay, so. Why raise this issue to you? Because the real point I wanted you to pay attention to was that floral arrangement. That floral arrangement blocked the potential trades. And there are many things that block trades. And so that's really the lesson of this. As long as we're on this digression, though, I feel duty-bound to carry the discussion to its end. So the question is, if indeed Harris is right that we should have long tables, why do we see round tables? And the answer is because of agency problems. The people who determine whether to have round tables or long tables aren't the guests. The determination's either made by somebody who cares an awful lot about floral arrangements, or by the caterer who feels that it's easier to serve round tables, which is the truth. Okay, so that's the agency problem. And now one final comment. How do I know I'm right? I love to have empirical evidence that suggests that I'm right. The way to find that is to look to the places where the guests actually determine whether you continue to do business. So if the guests have a vote, then you'll see long tables. The best example of this is an Oktoberfest beer hall. Or just look at a restaurant. Unless it's a Chinese restaurant with that Lazy Susan in the middle, you generally see long tables at restaurants. And the reason why is because somehow, perhaps not by thinking about it, but somehow the most successful restaurants were the ones that had long tables because they most promoted conversation. So I really do believe that I'm right. It's not just a matter of theory. The evidence is behind me. But most importantly, when a theory doesn't seem like it's working, there must be a reason. And the reason, of course, is the agency problems. So that had nothing to do with anything here. But if you ever want to use that example, please do. And now you know the full story. Okay, so let's talk about the settlement problem. So trust has 2 dimensions, as I mentioned earlier. There's trustworthiness and creditworthiness, and I won't repeat it here. I should, it's so important. Trustworthiness is willing to do what you say you want to do, and creditworthiness is being able to do it. A slight, not even slight, a very important distinction. Okay, counterparty risk is the risk that the person you're trading with, counterparty is a big word, but it encompasses sort of everything. It's the risk that the person you're trading with won't settle. And that could happen because your counterparty is not trustworthy. That's a real problem because it's an ethical problem. Or the counterparty may not be creditworthy, which is not an ethical problem, but still a serious problem. That's a physical problem. Counterparty risk increases with the time to settlement, and it increases with volatility. Now, it increases with time to settlement because between now and settlement, things could change, and a person who was originally creditworthy may prove to be no longer creditworthy, or a person you thought was trustworthy may now see new incentives that cause them to be less trustworthy. And both of those things are aggravated by volatility because volatility tends to change prices. And when prices change a lot, people often wish they hadn't done a trade. And so once they get that remorse, if they're dishonest, then you can fail to trade. Okay, so here we have, what do we got? Our 8 people again. Is that 8? Yes. And unfortunately, they don't trust each other. They're all strangers to each other, so there's no trade at all. So not much is going to happen in that economy. Most people are strangers to each other in large economies. And I'll tell you, unless you're in a very, very small village, that's in small ones as well. The nature of our society, this is modern society, is that we are always relating to people that we don't know. And so that's why this issue is of such incredible importance to understanding society and civilization. Nobody say I don't oversell my product here, huh? Okay, here are limited credit relationships. So I've drawn a line between the people who have credit relationships, and you'll see that there are 28 possible trades in this chart. Not all of them are shown, but only 11 in this picture because they've been limited by the credit relationships. So this is essentially the role of the floral centerpiece, right? The centerpieces seem to be blocking for whatever reason. And many of the reasons are people just don't know each other or they haven't done the research to know each other and so forth. Okay, so we've got to solve this problem. And so the question is how do we solve it? And the good news, in some cases, is that there are many ways to solve it, but some are much better than others. So we're going to talk about each of these elements. So rather than go through this list, why don't we just get to it as we get to it. So the first one is know your counterparty. So knowing your counterparty means go out and check their credit. So study the character and credit of your counterparty so that you can figure out whether you really do want to trade with them. So the problem here is that credit checks are expensive. You actually have to make some effort to figure out whether a person is trustworthy and creditworthy. And they're particularly expensive if you have to do many credit risks in order to find a suitable counterparty. So maybe what you do is you do the search first and then you do the credit check. But if the credit check doesn't work out, the time you spent searching is wasted. So if you do the credit checks first, then you can trade with anybody you already have credit with, but then you had to do a whole bunch of credit checks that you didn't need to do. So this is expensive any way you look at it. Now there are systems that are designed to lower the cost of this credit checking. And for that we have credit bureaus and a number of other systems that I'll talk about. Okay, so reputation plays a role here. Credit checks are substantially less expensive for traders who have well-known reputations. So if you know that other people know that this person's trustworthy, that may be good enough for you. So reputation is really valuable to traders. And when I say traders, I mean people. I mean everybody. We're all traders. So reputation is very important. Here's an argument for ethical behavior. Now, unfortunately, reputation may not be reliable if the counterparty is near bankruptcy, or quitting the business, or retiring soon, or perhaps even worse, maybe knows that they're going to pass away soon, that they're sick. Okay, so under those circumstances, people who aren't completely ethical may choose to run down their reputation and able to obtain some advantage over their counterparties. And that's unfortunate and something that we have to deal with in our society. Another way to solve the creditworthiness problem is to deal with intermediaries. So intermediaries vouch for their clients by guaranteeing their trades. This is what we see when brokers represent people to each other. The brokers don't always guarantee their trades. So for instance, in real estate, brokers will represent that the other party's creditworthy, but they won't guarantee the trade. but they're helping lower the cost of doing that research. But there are entities that do guarantee trades. Brokers generally do in the financial markets. Clearinghouses, banks and governments that provide letters of credit are effectively guaranteeing trade. Intermediation works best when the traders trust the intermediary, and the intermediation can vastly decrease the number of necessary credit checks. And for that, I have a few more pictures. So here's intermediation by a broker. So the broker's sitting in the middle. Now we only have to do 8 credit checks instead of the 28 potential ones that we saw before. So that's good. Let's take this a little further. Here are 3 brokers who are serving a total of 24 traders. And the brokers will vouch for each other's credit. So the brokers have checked each other's credit, and they're representing the various traders. And so now we have 27 relations instead of a potential of 276. That 276 got really big because of the n-squared story. And we'll see it get bigger in a few moments. Okay, so here's 8 brokers serving 64 traders. It's the same point I made before. Now we have 92 relations instead of 2,000. Now let's talk about clearinghouses. So the problem in this picture is that we have the 8 brokers. They all have to have credit relations with each other. And that number is starting to get big. So what if we stick a clearinghouse in the middle? So clearinghouses, what they do is they guarantee trades introduced to them by their clearing members. So if a clearing member defaults, then what happens is the other clearing members will ensure that the trade that was introduced to them actually settles. And then the clearing members guarantee their own clients' trades. So the clearing member has clients that say, I want to trade, and the clearing member says, okay, I'll introduce this to the clearinghouse, but if you fail, I'm going to be responsible. So I'm going to check and make sure that you have good credit. Okay, those could be included introducing brokers, or it might just be the brokerage clients of the clearing member. And then the brokers then guarantee their clients' trades. So if a client fails to perform, the broker performs on their behalf. If the broker fails to perform, the clearinghouse will perform. If the clearinghouse fails, then what happens is the other clearing members either have to make good for it. And if all hell breaks loose, then usually the central banker will cover it, but not necessarily. Okay, so here's a clearinghouse. Now I've got 8 clearing members and 64 trades. Now we have only 72 relations instead of the 2,000. It didn't change much because the clearinghouse primarily just reduced the connections between our 8 brokers. There weren't that many of those connections. Most of these connections, or potential connections, are between these 64 traders. Well, let's look at a more realistic calculation. Usually in a market, you'll have 1 clearinghouse, maybe 20 clearing members, perhaps more. You'll have 100 introducing brokers, and maybe 50 million clients. Okay, for that, you basically have about 50 million credit relations. It's each one of the clients to their broker. The other ones, the other pairs and so forth, just don't amount to a lot in this picture. And they will support, here we go, 1.25 quadrillion potential trade pairs. That's n squared. And that's why this is so powerful. Okay, so there's a second benefit of having clearinghouses. For contracts that are guaranteed by a clearinghouse, traders can offset their positions by simply trading out of the contract. So if a trader is both long and short, the clearinghouse looks at it and says, I'm guaranteeing your long position, I'm guaranteeing your short position. When settlement occurs, you have an obligation to make settlement, and you have an obligation to receive settlement. I'll just put you together and ignore you, because it doesn't matter. Okay, so the clearinghouse nets out that position. In contrast, suppose we have an over-the-counter contract, like a forward contract, between 2 people. So, and one person wants to get out of the contract. He says, hey, let me out of this contract. And the other guy says, I'm sorry, but we're contracted together. And I'm depending on you to perform. And he says, okay, here's my solution. Let me let somebody else step into my shoes. And your counterparty says, well, hang on a second. Is that person somebody that I know? Do they have credit as good as your credit? Are they willing to honor the terms, the delivery terms that we agreed to? It's very difficult to do this. And so it's hard to get out of contracts like that. So creating these central markets that trade a common interest, a common instrument, creates the potential for extraordinary liquidity. So what are the benefits of netting? The netting allows people to use future contracts to hedge local price risk very cheaply. This is why futures markets exist. And the hedge works well if the futures price and the local price are closely correlated. And this is for all sorts of commodities and financial instruments as well. Let me give you just one example in the corn market. Okay, so a risk-averse Nebraska farmer is growing corn, and all farmers are risk-averse. In fact, everybody's risk-averse. The problem is that that corn will drop in value if corn prices fall, which will hurt the farmer. So the farmer has a solution to this problem. Why don't I sell my harvest forward at a fixed price? Then I know that I'm going to get that price. So to hedge the price risk, the farmer could sell to the local miller, but that doesn't work so well. Instead, the farmer sells a futures contract obligating him to deliver corn in Chicago, which, oh, by the way, is 1,000 kilometers distant. That's a long way to carry corn. So we're not going to want to see that happen. So that would be done for delivery in November. But October comes by and the farmer sells his harvested corn to the local grain dealer and then buys back the November futures contract and thereby offsetting his delivery obligation. So the farmer actually never has to go to Chicago. And yet this works really well as long as the price of corn in Chicago and the price of corn in Nebraska are highly correlated. And they are highly correlated because even though it's costly to ship from one place to the other, it's not that costly. And if the price were substantially lower in one place than the other, what happens is that corn will be shipped from one place to the other. And in fact, it doesn't actually get shipped from Nebraska to Chicago. What happens is if the price is high in Chicago and low in Nebraska, all corn between Nebraska and Chicago will be shifted a little bit toward Chicago. So Nebraska will deliver to Iowa, Iowa delivers to Illinois, and Illinois delivers to upstate. Okay, so that's how it works. And it's just not all that expensive. It's a very, very efficient system. Works very nicely. Okay, so there are other ways to guarantee performance. We can have security deposits and performance bonds. So in the futures, security markets, and other places, we call this margin, but it's just security deposits. So intermediation guarantees, the guarantees that intermediators arrange, they often require that their clients deposit cash or securities so that the guarantor can use them to cover losses. So if you borrowed money to buy a security and the security drops in value, then the lender is getting nervous and say, can you give me back my loan? And so the lender says, oh, well, I'll tell you what, why don't I hold the securities, and when the security drops in value, I'm going to ask you to give me some more money to make me feel secure. And if you don't, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell those securities and use the proceeds to cover the loss. Okay? So to cover the value of the security. So that's basically how margin works. Probably all quite familiar with it. The system works best when we have liquid markets that produce informative prices. Liquid markets are necessary because the guarantor needs to be able to sell the collateral. And you want to have informative prices because you want the valuations to reflect true realities and not notions that things dropped and it'd be unfair to one person if you sold it at a low value or something like that. Okay. There are problems with the system. Poor people cannot post security deposits or performance bonds. So if you're in a place where there's a lot of poor people and you're thinking about trade and the need to guarantee futurity, this system doesn't work well. People have a tough time getting started. And so this is where the microloan market works. And there are mechanisms to enforce that. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Many contracts cannot be terminated by the guarantor to stop losses. This is in particular for contracts that involve services or the production of specialized goods. You just can't stop it because there's no liquidity. And so sometimes this system doesn't work so well. Performance bonds are one way to sort of deal with this. Many contracts for services require performance bonds. There are things that's basically, this is the forfeiting, the penalty that you'll forfeit if you don't perform. And sometimes it's held by the counterparty. Sometimes it's a government interested in the timely completion of a construction job. So the holder of the bond can use its value to finish the job. So I've been asked to speed up a little bit. So I'm going to just cover the basic elements, many of which are familiar to you of the other solutions. We're actually quite close to the end. So future business expectations can enforce contracts. So if you fail to perform, then you may lose the opportunity to do business in the future. And so that's another mechanism. It works best when people can give credible promises. And so there are conditions for what credible promises are, primarily that there is a potential for future business and some other issues. There are judicial solutions to settlement problems. Many of you are quite familiar with this. The legal solutions are lawsuits and the threat of lawsuit to get people to perform. But we all know that this is very expensive, and arbitration is a way of cheapening it, but it's still very expensive. Winning doesn't help you at all, though, if the counterparty is not creditworthy, if they cannot or will not perform anyway. Okay? So legal channels work best when there's a set of conditions that you're probably all familiar with, but basically that things are predictable, that the law is well-defined and comprehensive, the judgments need to be inexpensive and quick, and enforcement of judgments also has to be cheap and effective and hopefully quick. A final comment about a rule of law that I should mention here. Good enforcement mechanisms increase compliance. And with increased compliance, that obviates the need for using the enforcement actions in the legal environment. So this is why we want to have the legal system work well. In principle, when it's really working well, it won't be used a lot. In practice, I'm not sure if we're ever going to get near that, but that's in principle. So legal systems with predictable results shouldn't be used as much. Okay. There are extrajudicial solutions to settlement problems. So these we should talk about a bit. There's strongmen and the ostracization processes. So strongmen enforce contracts by threatening violence and sometimes even by following through. Of course, this solution only works for the stronger counterparty. Ostracization, that's probably I've only used this word orally for once or twice in my life. The threat of embarrassing people often can enforce a contract by running down a person's reputation. Remember, reputation is very important to get settlement. So these are systems that can allow you to do that. There are problems with extrajudicial solutions, as you know. They're often unfair. They expose both parties to significant costs, and they may promote escalating extrajudicial responses. Okay, so you don't want to have wars or other stuff going on. Don't let my polite language here minimize these dangers. This is really not where you want your economy to be. Okay, so last comments. Trusted family and friends. When all else fails, you just deal with the people that you know. And that's basically what less developed economies do. So family and friends are well known, so you can trade with them. When you trade with them, of course, you'll choose only the ones you believe are trustworthy and creditworthy. It works because perhaps the threat of embarrassment or banishing them from the family is enough to discipline them. It's the default system where markets and legal systems don't work very well. Okay? So the problems are the probability of finding a willing and capable counterparty is small when you're only dealing with family and friends, and that's because this number n is just really small. And likewise, finding the best person, the most capable or most cheapest, is also low because you're just not dealing with a lot of people. So, and then the last problem, which is sort of a moral or social one, is that disagreements among family over business issues often break up family, and that's not a good thing. Okay. Now, I have some comments here about ex post renegotiation, which is another settlement problem, but I'm going to skip through those in the interest of time, because we have many other people who need to speak today. So this is basically the problem of holdups, and of course I would have a few comments about Trump here and his relations, but not time for that here. So the solutions to the holdup problem basically are make sure that all the other settlement solutions work well. Okay, so in conclusion, trading among strangers, that's what facilitates growth. Trade works best when strangers can easily find each other and when there are contracts that involve elements of futurity that they work well. So growth depends on having systems that make these things happen well. Okay? So to arrange and settle trades, we have all these entities that we've discussed so far. The good rule of law facilitates low-cost settlement among traders. So implications for greater growth? Well, the foundations of economic growth depend on the infrastructure of trading and settlement. Countries that are interested in promoting growth clearly need to promote these elements of infrastructure. They are at the core of everything that yields value. Okay? And then, of course, countries with poor people, as I mentioned before, have to find ways of verifying or securing their credit. Microcredit works because of it's in small communities where reputation is very important. I would say, though, that the rule of law, this must be monitored to everybody's ears here, at least the attorneys, is most important because all the other systems work better. They depend upon it. So who imagined that N squared could be so interesting? And that's my talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry. Actually, I'm going to open up the floor. We've got about 5 minutes. And Venki, you must have been the best boy in class. Your hand is already up.
No, it almost felt like I was going back in time, sitting in one of his classes. I have two questions, Larry, for you. One is more in the market sense, which is we see time and again rating agencies screwing it up.
Yes.
And so given that, you have many mechanisms that you talked about of how do you ensure that they do their job well, I would like to hear some of your suggestions, if at all you have, in how can you make this work? Because they play a very important role, and as you can see, we are actually in India, we are going through one big crisis because they didn't do their job well. So that's one question.
Let's do one at a time. That one's a long answer already.
One thing on the trust deficit, because I think this network effect works when people believe in the system, in the sense that, these intermediaries do the job well. In India, for example, the amount of holdings in financial market is very low compared to real assets because they can trust the asset more than a financial security. So I'm thinking when there is a big gap between the two, all these mechanisms won't work because these can be captured. So is there a way in which you can...
Okay, so the second question is the easier one to answer. First, you have to create high-quality mechanisms and avoid a lot of scandals. Eventually, people will learn as they become more educated, and the systems will work. I have a lot of confidence in poor, uneducated people to seek their best advantage. There's often an awful lot of wisdom that we don't give people credit for because they're not well educated. But people who live their lives learn a lot of lessons that are most important to all of us. And many very educated people don't acquire that same wisdom because they're not paying attention. So education and wisdom are two different things. Wise people will eventually figure it out. Now, as to credit rating agencies, that's a much more difficult one. When I was chief economist at the SEC, we spent a lot of time working on this issue, and the solutions are very difficult. The big problem with credit rating agencies is getting people to pay for the ratings. And the problem is because ratings become public information very quickly. Why should anybody pay for it? And so credit rating agencies have a great deal of trouble raising the revenue necessary to do the research to provide a credit rating. And so quite often they are paid by the issuer to provide a credit rating. Now the issuer, of course, wants the highest possible credit rating, and so you now have a huge conflict of interest. And so the question is, how do you mediate that conflict of interest? And some of the solutions involve separating the salespeople from the researchers inside the firm, keeping track of the quality of the credit ratings so that you can have a benchmark that's publicly available to allow people to form opinions as to whether the credit rating agency is doing a good job. It's very difficult. Ultimately, the responsibility for determining credit lies with the investor or the trader. We'd like to rely as much as we can on credit rating agencies. Perhaps their ultimate function is simply the assembly of unbiased information or largely unbiased information that makes it easier for people to form their own judgments. So you may see them in this light as more as librarians or research report writers than people who are drawing conclusions. Some more questions? Yes.
great talk. I just had a small question regarding, now if we apply this linear reasoning of n, the number of trades is directly proportional to the number of traders, how do you balance that with the regulatory objective of not having speculation in the market, which is often relied upon extensively in India? How did SEC manage the balance between speculation and liquidity? Just that.
Okay, so first of all, the n that we're talking about here is actually n squared. It's quadratic. So what we're looking for is not to maximize the number of trades, but to get lots of good trades. And there's more potential with larger n. And now the question is how to balance speculation versus other somewhat, what we think of as the more legitimate uses. So when we speak of speculation, let's be really careful with our words. The dictionary meaning of the word speculation is actually informed trading. Speculation is trading on information where you have a reason to believe that you're going to win. And we like speculation of that type. We like the informed trading because they make our prices highly informative. And by making prices highly informative, they're useful. People do all sorts of interesting things with prices to make production efficient. So I think probably what you were referring to when most people discuss speculation, they're actually talking about gambling, about people who are using the markets for their pleasure or for foolishness or something like that. And that's troubling because they potentially can make prices less informative, because if you have a lot of people who are buying foolishly, they'll push prices up and then prices doesn't reflect value. Now here's the good news about gamblers. Gamblers end up losing money because they're not well informed. So trading is a zero-sum game when you measure the performance against the market index. And the reason is because the average performance of all traders has to equal the average performance of everything that they hold. Everything that they hold is the market index. And the reason is because everything that is held is equal to everything that's available to be held. And so if somebody's outperforming the market, somebody else is underperforming the market. So the gamblers underperform because they're not well informed. They're trading without having the benefit of really seeing the future well, or even poorly. That means that the informed traders are able to win. So the gamblers and other people who trade foolishly, or people who trade for other legitimate reasons, like investing. Investing is moving money from the present to the future. You don't have to be informed, you just have to have a reason to do that. Like I do that all the time because there'll be a time when I can't speak like this and I don't get paid for doing this speech, but where USC won't be paying me, and I need to have money in my future so that I can live comfortably in my retirement. So lots of people trade for those reasons too. All these people who are trading for these reasons unrelated to information provide the fuel that allow the informed traders to make money. They make the markets liquid. And when the informed traders are making money, that allows them to do the research that ultimately makes the prices more informative. And that's a benefit that we all derive. So while we're concerned about the dangers of gambling, those dangers are primarily individual gamblers, that people who shouldn't be gambling are gambling and end up ruining their lives and perhaps those of people around them. That's very troubling. That's a problem that we have everywhere. So I would suggest that public lotteries waste liquidity, because a lot of people gamble in public lotteries, but they don't produce any benefit for the rest of us other than taxation benefits, right? The public lotteries raise taxes. If those people were gambling instead in the financial markets, our prices would be more efficient, there'd be more liquidity, and so people would be able to solve investment problems and hedging problems and other problems more efficiently, and that would be good. So that's why one reason that I don't like public lotteries. On a personal basis, I don't like them because I don't personally believe in voluntary taxation.
That's a tough explanation to use with the regulators here, but we'll think about how to use that. Thanks a lot, Larry. And I'm gonna, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question.
That's the last one, and if you can keep it short. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, great talk, like especially the institutional mechanism of clearing houses and how they affect trading, reduces friction, it reduces cost. So do we have a quantitative idea about like, you know, the effect on growth that we get when we move towards such institutionalization, and you have this clearing house, and then you have a set of, you know, the brokers and then introductory brokers. Should we have instead of a one-tier structure, a two-tier structure, and you know, the impact on the growth in a quantitative fashion? Do you have a understanding of that?
How do we know that what I've said is true? Okay, so the simplest and most compelling evidence is to look at countries like Albania that did not promote free trade. And then when they opened up their market, they became much more wealthy. Singapore is a great example of this. China is a really good example. China has become extraordinarily wealthy because despite the communist system, they haven't become extraordinarily wealthy, but their wealth has increased extraordinarily quickly because they've allowed free trade. Or look at Venezuela, where they've done just the opposite, and they've totally ruined their economy. There is so much cross-sectional, so much national evidence for these issues. Sometimes they involve financial markets, sometimes they don't, but the financial markets certainly help out. They help because they allow people to solve very important financing problems, many of which involve production. It takes capital to do things, and our financial markets are ultimately designed to ensure that capital can be moved from one place to another where it can be used most efficiently, to allow people to save so that they can become more mobile, so they're not dependent on their families for their retirement, which of course is hurting families, but it's producing production. So there's a social trade-off that one might want to consider. But the financial markets are extraordinarily important, and when they work well, they definitely contribute to the value of the economy.
I have a follow-up question.
No, time out.
So we're,
Okay,
I
I'm
will be
gonna-
happy to take questions throughout the conference. I love talking about these issues. I want to thank you all for your attention and encourage you to take the ideas that I've just shared with you. As I promised, there are things that I'm sure that you already knew, but perhaps I've given you maybe one, perhaps two different tools or perspectives that will allow you to promote these ideas to other people. Because through your efforts and the efforts of the people that you influence and teach, the entire world will be better.
Thank you.